So welcome along. Today is a very good day. It's a day when I speak with Jeff Ollerton about pollinators, bird pollinators. But I want to say that I am very happy to have you here on In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. And before I go any further, I must quickly say that this whole series is sponsored by Cower Sporting Optics, the manufacturer of the world-renowned Promenade series spotting scopes, and also Birds, Wildlife and Nature, the tour company that strives to deliver the best of birding and wildlife watching opportunities throughout the world. So thank you very much, you guys, for allowing us to have this opportunity to put out these Zoom interviews. By the way, in conservation with, for those who are unfamiliar, are or is a series of Zoom interviews, which basically features some of the movers and shakers in the world of conservation. And it's an idea that was spawned during lockdown, during the pandemic. 4 years ago, I was in Spain on my own in a room, well, actually in an apartment. And I don't know if you remember, but in Spain, the actual lockdown was draconian. You weren't allowed out apart from maybe 10 minutes to go to the store. So I spent 3 months indoors effectively, and I wanted to talk to people. And I thought, what a great idea! Why don't I just get people to come and talk to me? So it's kind of spawned from there. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to our guest tonight. Today, his name is Jeff Ollerton, and we're going to be talking about birds as pollinators. Jeff, how are you, and where are you?
I'm very good. Thank you, David. I'm currently in Market Harborough, which is right in the centre of England. If anyone knows it, South Leicestershire, right up against the Northamptonshire border.
We will find out today, Jeff, that you have traversed the world in your pursuit of knowledge. For those who know nothing about Jeff, let me quickly give you an outline. During his career spanning more than 30 years, Professor Jeff Ollerton, by the way, Jeff, Professor or just Jeff?
Jeff is fine. Jeff is absolutely fine.
Okay, well, you've established himself or yourself as one of the most, or one of the world's leading experts on pollinators and pollination. And you are the author of more than 170 articles and book chapters. His highly cited, groundbreaking research has been used by national and international agencies to support the efforts to conserve pollinators and their pollination services. Jeff is also in demand as an advisor and a consultant to governments, local authorities, printed and broadcast media, and funding organizations, plus in conservation with. In 1921, his book Pollinators and Pollination, Nature and Society was published by Pelagic to unanimous positive reviews. In February 24, he published the book we're talking about today, Birds and Flowers, an intimate 50 million year relationship, also for Pelagic, which has likewise been well received. And I can tell you now that this book is absolutely fascinating. It's full of so much information. We're going to be just scratching the surface tonight. Although he's based in the UK, Jeff's fieldwork in support of his research and advisory activities have been conducted across Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, and Australia. He received his PhD in pollination ecology in 1993 from Oxford Brookes University and holds visiting professor positions even at the University of Northampton in the UK, Cunningham Institute of Botany in China, and Jeff has previously held visiting research or researcher positions at the University of Campinas, Unicamp in Brazil, and the University of New South Wales in Australia. So, I mean, this man, I'm honored to have you here, being here. And the other thing I learned about you, you're a bit of a Led Zeppelin fan, is that right?
Yeah, huge Led Zeppelin fan. Yes, that's right.
So I'll be doing my research.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. It's almost like you look at Facebook occasionally.
So
Yeah. Big
Before,
music fan generally. Yeah.
oh, really? Do you play anything, by the way?
Yeah. Bit of acoustic guitar. In fact, I'm going to mention acoustic guitars in when I give a short presentation in a moment. But yeah, a little bit of acoustic guitar. But I used to have very, very long hair. That was a long time ago.
Yeah. But it's interesting for those watching in the future on YouTube. By the way, if you are watching this on YouTube in the future, you know what to do. Like and subscribe. Tell everyone, even your enemies, tell everyone about In Conservation With because there's such a broad spread of different people that I've spoken to over the years, 180 different people about a ton of different subjects, and this is going to be one of the brilliant ones as well. Um, Now, you weren't born an ecologist, so tell me, how did you kind of get into this whole field?
Uh, I wasn't born an ecologist. It's an interesting way to put it. I mean, for as long as I can remember, I was, the archetypical kid who was turning over rocks or looking in rock pools, uh, scurrying around in the grass looking for grasshoppers and beetles and so on. It's been something that's been part of my life forever. Um, but I was brought up in the northeast of England. You might be able to tell from my slight northeastern accent. I was born in and raised in Sunderland, and so my early natural history experiences, like yours, were all urban. But for me, it was old demolition sites and bomb sites along the River Wear, where I grew up. Um, and so that's one of the things that sort of set the mold for me as an ecologist was discovering this amazing natural history that was all around me within a big urban industrialized conurbation.
Well, I must correct myself and take that back. I think you were born an ecologist. I was just
Yeah,
testing. Obviously, you were. You
yeah,
passed the test.
yeah. I was, yeah,
I mean, what I love about your book is, well, apart from the fact it's amazing in terms of information in there, but you also have a chapter where you talk about urban pollinators, and I found that very fascinating because I think we'll talk about it later, but I just think the urban world as an area, as a biodiverse area, is often overlooked or looked upon as being, oh, it's an accident or it's just foxes and what have you. So, there's so much more that goes on in urban worlds, and we need to be talking more to urban people for them to understand that they are part of this whole sort of fabric of life. It's not just, the city and then nature's outside. It's actually we're all part of that fabric. So
yeah,
we
yeah.
need.
No, completely agree. And in fact, we also need to get across the message that really, it's not just that the cities support, in this case, pollinators, but actually the pollinators themselves are supporting a lot of what is going on in the cities. I mean, something like a fifth of all global crop production is done in and around um, towns and cities around the world, and many of those crops, beans and squashes and fruit crops and so on are pollinated mostly by insects, but by in some cases by birds as well. It's kind of you to mention both of my books. That's the first book that I did for Pelagic. That's Pollinators and Pollination, Nature and Society, and that's got a whole chapter about urban pollinators and the way in which, let's say, urban areas support pollinators, but the pollinators also play a role in urban crop production as well. It's a really fascinating area, and yeah, still lots to be discovered in there.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's all under our noses. That's the thing.
Mm.
We're out there searching in the middle of nowhere and thinking about sending rockets to Mars when underneath our noses, there's stuff going on we don't even know about or don't realize is
Yeah,
happening. And I didn't
yeah.
actually, as just to sort of throw this in, I didn't realize that 90% of plants rely on pollination. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, 90% of flowering plants and a good chunk of the gymnosperms as well. So there's about I'll talk about this when I give a little presentation in a moment, but there's something like 352,000 species of flowering plants globally, most of them in the tropics. Uh, and we know that 90% of them are pollinated mainly by insects, but also by other groups as well. I'll mention some of those and how diverse they are. But what's also interesting is that we think we have information about the pollinators of about 10% of the flowering plants. So we know that most of them are animal pollinated, but we don't know what the pollinators are. So even though we've been studying pollinators and their interactions with flowers for probably 200 years, there's still only about 10% of species have actually been studied in any kind of detail at all. So there's massive amounts of undiscovered information, undiscovered interactions between species that we still, as scientists and as conservationists, don't know about.
It's amazing. Well, I'll tell you what, let's have a look at your presentation because I think I'm just fascinated, and I'm sure everyone else watching is to see how this all works.
Sure.
And for those unfamiliar with Zoom, I'm sure there's no one out there, but watch this on speaker view, and you'll have the whole image on your screen.
Okay, you've got that there.
Yes, it's all perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, so what I thought I'd do is because, most people have got an idea about pollinators, but not necessarily birds as pollinators. I thought, before we get really into the meat of the conversation or conservation, I thought I'd just give a sort of an overview of what birds, how birds interact with flowers, really, and so it's an introduction to that. And if people want to know more about it, or get in touch with me, there's my website address down at the bottom. They can. I've got a contact form on there. They get in touch with me through that. So there's the cover of the book, Birds and Flowers, an intimate 50 million year relationship, as you say, published by Pelagic. Do you like the cover, David? Can I ask you a question? Do you like the cover?
You know what? Your cover was so attractive. It pulled me in immediately because many sort of nature books at the moment have a very kind of identikit cover. This for me stood out by miles. I love the image of the. Is that a weaver or an oriole? Must be an oriole.
It's a weaver. It's a Cape weaver from
Okay.
South Africa.
Okay, but I love
Yeah,
the no, I love the colors, the simplicity of it, and it really
yeah,
made me look. And I love blue anyway, so yeah,
yeah,
it, I was
yeah.
sold.
Good. Yeah, a lot of people like it. It was done by a good friend of mine, Stephen Valentine, who's a fantastic artist, and I was just over the moon when he produced that cover. So yeah, most people like it. Mark Avery didn't like the cover, but he didn't like the fact that there was a big ampersand there between birds and flowers in his review. But yeah, there's no pleasing Mark all the time.
I
Anyway,
think
let's start.
really
Sorry, go
worked.
on.
Sorry, the ampersand I think really does work. I think it's a really nice
Yeah,
thing. Simple design. It's nice.
yeah, yeah. No, I liked it as well. So let's move in. Let's start. Right at the beginning, right with the basics, and talk about plant sex, and think about what pollinators actually are. Because flowering plants, they have a big problem. Uh, if they're going to reproduce, if they're going to reproduce sexually by making seeds, they've got to move pollen around, and the pollen, of course, contains the male sex cells. They've got to move it from one flower to the stigma of another flower. The stigma is the receptive female surface there. Pollen germinates there, and then it grows down through the style and fertilizes the ovules. The ovules turn into seeds. That's the next generation started. The problem, of course, is that plants can't move around to find a mate. So they've got to recruit help. They've got to recruit a third party to move that pollen. And for some plants, that third party is wind. So anybody who suffers from hay fever, for example, knows that things like grasses, some of the larger trees, things like birch and beech and oak and so on, they move massive amounts of pollen around on the wind. But it's incredibly inefficient way to do it. But nonetheless, they're pretty successful at that. There's another group of plants, aquatic plants that use water. They use water currents in the same way as wind currents for moving that pollen around. But the majority of flowering plants, as we've just said, use animals like insects and birds as that third party to move the pollen around. So that's what pollinators are. And as we've already said, something like 90% of the flowering plants are animal pollinated. And the major groups of pollinators, things like bees, over 20,000 species, approaching 20,500 species now. New species being discovered all the time. Flies are really important as well. True flies, Diptera, over 55,000 species of those are known to act as pollinators. Um, Beetles can be incredibly important as well, over 77,000 of those. The biggest group by far, actually, the butterflies and moths. And these are global figures, of course. I'm not talking about figures in the UK here. These are global figures. The biggest group by far is the butterflies and moths, over 140,000 species of those, and probably 90% of those are moths. And then we've got the birds, about 1,400 species are thought to act as pollinators. And I'll come back to that figure in a moment. But then you've got smaller groups, some of the wasps, bats, even lizards, cockroaches as well. There's about a dozen plants globally that we know of, which are pollinated in quite specialized relationships with cockroaches. So again, the total known diversity of pollinators might be about 350,000 species, which is about 1 in 10 of all described animal species. Most of them are insects, and there's many, many more to be still discovered out there. So there's a huge diversity of animals which act as pollinators. When we think about birds as pollinators, this is often the image that comes to mind. Iconic images like this hummingbird. It's a buff-tailed coronet feeding on a fuchsia species in Colombia, taken by a student who I got to know on a course a few years ago, Alexander Schlattman. These iconic images of hummingbirds hovering and feeding on nectar and flowers. And those images have really got into the public consciousness when we talk about birds as pollinators, even to the extent that they're being used to brand everything from guitars. So this is the pick guard of a Gibson hummingbird guitar, which was actually designed by a guy who worked in the Gibson factory back in the 60s and who was a keen bird watcher. And he decided to inscribe this on the pickguard there. But being used to sell everything from guitars through to beers and even into wines. And the hummingbirds, I'm going to get a bit technical here, belong to the family Trochilidae, which is part of an order, a higher taxonomic group called the Apodiformes. And their closest living relatives are, in fact, the swifts, which also belong to the Apodiformes. But it's a big family, 364 species. It's just gone up, actually. It used to be 363, and literally in the last few months, they've split the giant hummingbird, Patagonia gigas, into two different species. So we're now up to 364 species. And all of these hummingbirds visit flowers for nectar, but they all eat insects and spiders and so on as well. They don't just subsist on nectar. They eat other things as well. So those are the classic birds as pollinators image that probably most people have got in their mind. And that image has a deep historical roots for humanity. So the oldest images of hummingbirds that we know of come from the Nazca culture in South America, in what is now Peru. And the Nazca are most famous for producing these huge geoglyphs on the floor of the desert. They are massive, many tens of meters in size, things like spiders and monkeys and so on. And included within those images are these huge hummingbirds. But the other thing that the Nazca produced were these polychrome pots, which had a variety of different functions, storage and drinking, and so on. And quite often they put hummingbirds onto those pots, and just occasionally they showed hummingbirds visiting flowers. And those are actually the oldest known representations of bird-flower interactions. And I include this picture in my book. And actually, one of the things I talk about there is the fact that if you look very, very closely at those birds, each bird is a different species. So here's an artisan from 1,000 years ago telling us about the ecology of the birds and flowers that they were seeing in this area of Peru, but also perhaps telling us something about taxonomy as well, about the diversity of different birds that they were seeing in the area where they lived. So I say there's about 1,400 bird species which act as pollinators. We think there's about 11,000 bird species in total. So about 13% of birds are known or suspected pollinators. But the hummingbirds are just one family within there. And in fact, at least 74 out of the 253 families of birds act as pollinators. And those birds, those families belong to 11 out of the 41 different orders. And if we look at a family tree of those birds, which I'm going to in a moment, we'll see how they kind of map onto the different orders. But before we do that, just worth pointing out that the earliest fossil evidence that we have of interactions between birds and flowers goes back to about 47 million years ago. And this is where the subtitle of my book comes from, 50 million year relationship. It's a bit of artistic license there. 47 million years, 50 million years. It's not far off. And this is a bird which was found in what is now Europe, with pollen in its guts. It's clearly been feeding on flowers in one way or another, and it's the earliest example that we have, and it's from a genus called Pumilionis that doesn't belong to any of the modern groups of flower visiting birds. Just to put this in perspective, insects were pollinating flowering plants probably 150 million years ago. There's a lot of controversy around that, but certainly 140 to 150 million years ago was when that relationship started. So birds were pretty late to the party. Insects got there long before. Let's say if we map the pollinating birds onto a family tree of the birds, we see that birds as pollinators pop up in all of these different orders. The galliforms, which includes the quails and landfowl. We've got the apodiformes down there, the swifts and hummingbirds, the cuckoos, things like parrots, things like woodpeckers as well. And of course, the biggest group of all, the passerines, the passeriformes, which includes 60% of the bird species diversity. Excuse me. So yeah, woodpeckers. We know that at least 18 out of the 233 species of woodpeckers act as pollinators, about 8%. There's a Cuban green woodpecker, photographed by my colleague Bo Dalsgaard, who did published a short paper about this a few years ago. And then you got other unexpected groups like the crows and ravens. There's a review by James Fitzsimmons a few years ago showing at least a quarter of the 40 species of corvus feed on nectar, directly feed on nectar. This is not destroying the flowers. This is actually going to the flowers from the front end, potentially acting as pollinators, and actually feeding directly on the nectar. And then within the passerines, you've got some really quite big families, all of which visit flowers. The species of all of species of which all of them visit flowers. Um, Things like the honey eaters in Australia, into Papua New Guinea, and into Oceania, the sunbirds and spider hunters from Africa and Asia and the Middle East, um, and then the white eyes and Yuhinas and allies, which are also Asian and African. So big families. And then much smaller groups, things like the wood hoopus, which actually until very recently we thought only ever fed on insects. Now we know they'll visit flowers and they will feed on nectar as well. That's a relatively recent discovery. And then things like tanagers as well, photographed here in Brazil, or some of the chats. There's a moorland chat pollinating flowers of one of the giant lobelias on Mount Kenya, another one of Alexander Schlatman's images from the book. And something to notice is the pollen on the bird's forehead there. You can see this pale pollen there, showing that it's definitely moving the pollen around. And then finally, this is Argentina. It's an Argentinian cactus, which looks as if it ought to be moth-pollinated. Many moth-pollinated flowers have got these tubular white flowers, but actually, we know from work by another colleague of mine, Pablo Gorostiaga, that it's birds like this grey-hooded Sierra finch, which actually pollinates this endemic cactus. So if we put all of that together, actually about half of the pollinating bird species don't belong to those big three families of the sunbirds, the honey eaters, and the hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are important, honey eaters and sunbirds are important, but so are these other groups as well. So just to talk a little bit more about what I cover in the book, we've mentioned urban ecology and urban pollinators. And I have a chapter in there called Urban Flowers for Urban Birds, in which I started off by talking about a trip to China I made back in 2017 for a conference in the city of Shenzhen, which is one of these huge mega cities that China has produced in the last few decades. It's also a very green city as well. And we encountered pollinating birds in and around Shenzhen. Things like this Swinno's white-eye, which I talk about at the beginning of that chapter, which unfortunately I found dead, but it was an interesting close encounter with that particular bird. And I have a section in there where I use the subsection title that a city without birds is like a bird without feathers. And that segues into a later section in which I talk about urban birds more broadly. And that section is called "And a city without birds is not a city at all," which I suspect you'll probably agree with, David. I also talk about conservation within the book, and the last two chapters are about conservation. Chapter 18 is called "What Escapes the Eye," and I'll explain where that title comes from in a moment. But I start the chapter off by talking about this particular image, which I include in the book, which is it's a pretty poor image. I snapped this rainbow lorikeet actually on my mobile phone. And these birds, this was on the suburban streets of Sydney. This rainbow lorikeet was visiting this Banksia tree, flowers of this Banksia tree, and they're incredibly confiding. You can get really quite close to them. But the reason why it has this weird, washed out, slightly yellowy color is not any fault of my phone. That was the color of the air at the time that we were there in late 2019, early 2020, when we had the most incredible bushfires burning all around Sydney. And this was the light being filtered through the smoke and ash in Sydney at that time. Um, and I talk about the impact of climate change and bushfires and of extinctions and so on. The title comes from this quote by uh, a Central American ecologist who's worked mainly in Costa Rica, a guy called Dan Jansen. And back in the 70s, he in an article he wrote, he said that what escapes the eye, however, is a much more insidious kind of interaction, the interaction of ecological interactions, because often when we lose species, yeah, losing a species becoming extinct, is a real tragedy. But we don't only lose that species, we lose the interactions between that species and the other species with which it coexisted. And there's some great examples, or rather poignant examples from Hawaii, for example, where the Hawaiian honeyeaters, of which there were 5 species, in the family Mahoides, the whole family is now extinct. It's the only example of a whole plant family going extinct, and the last species went extinct actually in the 1980s. And what it's done is to leave behind a whole group of plants which depended upon these honey eaters for pollination, and now which largely don't set any seeds and fruit at all because they've lost their pollinators. And similarly in Hawaii, the Hawaiian honey creepers, which are a subfamily of finches, but 51 species of those, more than half are now extinct. 25 of them a percent of them are critically endangered, and half of those are probably extinct. They haven't been seen for a long time. So chapter 18 is a fairly is fairly depressing. It's a fairly sobering overview of the state of pollinating birds from a conservation perspective. But I couldn't leave the chapter on a down, or leave the book on a downer. I had to finish with an optimistic chapter, and so the final chapter, chapter 19, is called "The Restoration of Hope." Um, and there's 2 aspects of that. One is one of the ways in which I take some hope or some optimism from the natural world, is the fact that species are hugely adaptable. Species change their distributions, whether we like it or not. And there's a great example there of this plant, the bird, the scarlet honeyeater, which is an important pollinator of a lot of plants in eastern Australia, including this grevillea here. And it's a quote from a guy called Jeff Park, who I had the pleasure to meet when I was in Australia, who has this amazing blog called Natural Newstead, where he talks about the birds around that part of Victoria. And he back in 2022, he's talking about the scarlet honeyeater, and he said it was once considered an absolute rarity in central Victoria, but now the species is regularly observed, being increasingly reported around Melbourne, where it was once very rare. And it's also found further west. So it's a really good example of birds changing their distribution for no apparent reason. And of course, we've got lots of examples of that in Britain. Things like the collared dove or the little egret, Chetty's warbler, all of which were incredibly rare, even non-existent in Britain maybe 50 or 60 years ago, which now are quite common birds. This is one of the things that birds do. But the other reason why I have some degree of optimism is that there's a lot of habitat restoration projects going on globally, some of which are focused specifically on pollinating birds. For example, the Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project on Hawaii, or the Inkungsu Sunbird Restoration Project in South Africa, which is trying to link up pollinator gardens in schools with patches of nature reserves in and around Table Mountain. And even, country level or continent level restoration projects, things like the Great Green Wall in Africa, for example, south of the Sahara, or China's Grain for Green program, which has done some incredible things around habitat restoration in parts of China where whole landscapes were being degraded in the 60s and 70s for food production. A lot of that natural habitat is coming back now. With them, the birds and native plants and insects and so on, and a lot of this sort of feeds into the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, of course, which runs through till 2030 and probably beyond. So that's an overview of what I cover in the book and what's been keeping me occupied for the last couple of years while I wrote it.
Well, you know what, Jeff, thank you for that. I think it's an absolutely fascinating subject. And as I said right at the very top, it's something we can only scratch the surface on tonight
Yeah,
because it's just there's so many questions that I want to ask. One thing
yeah,
actually, just enough to do with pollination actually, but the Nazca artwork where it shows
mm,
that bird from above. There's been lots of books written about that, hasn't it? Because
yeah,
why produce such a massive piece of art on the ground back then when there was no mountains nearby? Who's going to be seeing it?
yeah. It's a good question. I mean, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories around aliens and so on. It was probably more to do. I think the best explanation I've heard of it is that actually it was to do with um, people walking a sort of a sacred path, if you like. So each of those um, geoglyphs was associated with a particular group within the that tribe, that the Nazca people, and members of that group once a year perhaps just walked that path, and it kind of linked them back to their totemic animals, if you like. That's the best explanation I've heard of it, but I mean we will probably never know. I'm
Yeah,
glad they're there.
I prefer the aliens, a bit more exciting. Now I was surprised because, as you said earlier, the poster bird, the poster family when it comes to pollination are the hummingbirds. And I was surprised, A, at the number of different types of birds, different families that indulge in pollination of some sort, and particular groups of people of birds, like, for example, the cuckoos.
Mm.
Um, I didn't understand how does a cuckoo, because I always think of cuckoos eating caterpillars.
Yeah. So there's only one example, actually. There's only one species of cuckoo which is known to visit flowers with any kind of regularity. That doesn't mean that others don't do it, but there's only one that's known to do it, and that's actually on Galapagos, and it's the endemic Galapagos cuckoo. And it visits quite a lot of the birds on Galapagos visit flowers, particularly of the prickly pears, which flower in the dry season when there's not very much else available to for them to eat. Um, all of the finches, for example, all of Darwin's finches visit the flowers of prickly pear and feed on either nectar or the pollen. Um, and for some of those birds, the pollen is absolutely critical to the development of the young birds, because there are no other sources of protein at that time of the year. All the insects have gone into the summer equivalent of hibernation, what we call estivation, if you like. And again, that's a fairly recent discovery by a group from Spain. So that was published in the last few years.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I didn't appreciate that this whole idea of pollination has been going on for eons.
Mm.
Have birds got a kind of a structural sort of blueprint now for that? Is there kind of, I mean, when I think of a bird that feeds on nectar, I'm thinking of
Mhm.
long decurved bills or at the very least long straight bills. Is that the basic design, or is there other things that help a bird to actually to feed on nectar and to pollinate?
Yeah, well, for certainly some birds fit that model. Most of the hummingbirds do. I mean, some of the hummingbirds have got fairly short beaks, but they're still long and thin. But what they also have is tongues which extend far out beyond their bills, and can take up nectar. And it used to be thought that they took nectar up almost like kind of mopping it up, and that's certainly true for some of the other bird groups. But um, for the hummingbirds, it's actually more of a kind of a pumping mechanism. They do these very rapid muscular sort of contractions, which almost pumps the nectar up into their mouths. I say other groups of birds have um, mops on the end of the tongue, which soak up the nectar. But for many of the flower visiting birds, there's no specific adaptation. So some of the migratory warblers, for example, both in the New World and in the Old World, on their return flights from either Africa or the Mediterranean or Central and Northern South America, as they return back north, they'll visit flowers on the way back, feed on nectar, which probably provides them with a lot of fuel for that return flight, and they'll pick up pollen on the way. So it's not uncommon for birds ringers in Britain, for example, to find tits and warblers who've come from further south that have got these pollen horns on the front of their heads, which is an accumulation of pollen that they've picked up as they've been moving north. So they might not have any specific adaptations to nectar feeding because they're generalists, but nonetheless, the nectar is really important, as I say, for fueling those migratory flights.
And what about the plants themselves, the flowers? Are they kind of aware? I mean, as plants can be, I don't know how it works, but do they, when they know that there's a bird visiting, do they kind of then start producing more nectar? Is it easy for the bird to receive it? Does it kind of ooze out as soon as the plant's aware that the bird's there?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, flowers can be very receptive to pollinators, not in a kind of an awareness or what we would think of as being, conscious awareness. But certainly many flowers, the more nectar you take out, the more nectar they will produce. That doesn't happen all the time, but it happens for quite a number of flowers. So they're automatically reacting to the removal of nectar by producing more nectar.
And what is the benefit of birds as pollinators? I mean, again, when you think as a layperson about pollination, the first thing you think about, oh, bees, and that's what you think
Yeah.
about. You think about mosquitoes and all those other insects that actually pollinate. But why? I mean, what does a bird add to the whole picture? Surely it could be covered by the many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of species you just mentioned earlier. So what do birds bring to the table?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is something I talk about in the book, um, and I go into some detail, and at the end I say actually we don't we don't know why. So if we look at it, if we look at it in evolutionary terms, all of the examples of bird pollination are flowers that have evolved from insect pollinated ancestors, usually bee pollinated ancestors. So then you've got to ask, that question that you just framed there. What is the advantage of birds over the insects? And lots of different ideas have been put forward, lots of different hypotheses. One is that birds, generally speaking, will fly longer distances than most bees or most insects. So in plant population terms, that kind of keeps those populations of plants together. They're spreading their genes further, to put it simply. So that's one advantage. Another advantage, of course, is that birds are warm-blooded, whereas most insects, not all insects, but most insects are cold-blooded. They take on the temperature of the surrounding ambient conditions. And so that means that birds can fly in very wet conditions or very cold conditions when insects generally wouldn't be able to fly. And that may give some plants an advantage if they flower at those times of the year when it's cold and wet. Um, Other potential advantages is that birds don't groom pollen off their bodies in the way that bees groom pollen off their bodies. So there's a sort of a hygiene hypothesis when it comes to that as well. And each of those different hypotheses might be true for some groups of plants, but not true for other groups of plants. So there's probably no single reason why birds have an advantage for the plants over insects. And there's probably other reasons that we haven't even thought of. But there's been a lot of speculation about that, but we're pretty much scratching the surface of answering that question as well.
Yes, it's absolutely. I'm so fascinated by this subject. I mean, for example, when I started thinking about speaking to you today, I was thinking, okay, the poster birds or families, hummingbirds, and interestingly, they're only found in the New World. And then
Mhm.
when I started thinking about the Old World, I was thinking, well, maybe honey creepers, maybe some birds. And then I started thinking even more focused on Britain and Europe, where I live. And I was thinking, what birds pollinate anything in Britain and Europe
Mhm.
on a regular basis?
Really, really good question. If you'd asked me that about 20 years ago, I would have repeated the received wisdom that there are no plants in Europe that are pollinated by birds. And then about 2011, a Spanish scientist, woman called Ana Ortega Olivencia, discovered that an endemic European tree, a thing called Anagyrus fetida, which is a type of legume. It's a leguminous tree, member of the pea and bean family. Flowers in the winter in southern Spain, and is visited by tits and warblers, things like blackcaps and chipchafs, for example, and some of the tits as well. And it's pollinated very, very effectively by that. And that was the first documented example of a native European plant which was pollinated by birds. I mean, what's interesting, we've those birds were described by scientists 200 years ago. Similarly, the plant was described and well documented 150 years ago. So, but the interaction between those two groups had only just been documented in the 21st century. And Anna's gone on and she's found other examples. Some of the figworts, for example, in southern Europe are also bird pollinated. But if we think of Britain, if you think about willows, early flowering willows in the spring, and the way in which blue tits, grey tits, chiffchaffs, for example, visit the flowers there. They're often visiting flowers of different types of willows, feeding on the nectar there, moving pollen around. And it's been speculated for quite a while that they might be actually pollinating those willows, but nobody's ever done the experiments to prove that that's the case or not. So even very familiar birds and plants in Britain, there's still a lot to discover.
Yeah. I love the fact you name check everyone. You know everyone's names. Brilliant. I love that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I imagined if anything, there'll be cases of birds brushing against, you know, plants or flowers and getting pollen on their plumage. I mean, is that a strategy used anywhere by the plant world?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the birds are not going there to pollinate. The birds are going there usually to feed on nectar or sometimes to feed on pollen. So the birds aren't consciously pollinating. So in a sense, all of this is accidental pollen transfer as far as the bird is concerned. As far as the flower is concerned, in some example, some flowers they have very, very precise places where they'll place a little dab of pollen, maybe underneath the chin of a hummingbird or on the forehead of the hummingbird. But in other cases, the pollen will get dusted all over the bird and move around. Um, that's an interesting choice of picture behind you, actually. I know what that plant is. It's a thing called I think it's a thing called Stachyta feta, which is a South American species, which actually is quite invasive in parts of Africa and Asia, and which is mainly bee pollinated, but hummingbirds do visit it as well. And the hummingbirds probably aren't pollinators because the pollen ends up on the bill of the hummingbird. And of course, the bill of most birds is quite smooth, and the pollen just brushes off. Whereas if it was really adapted to hummingbird pollination, it might well place the pollen on the forehead, or as I say, or under the chin of the bird.
Well, I thought you were going to impress me by telling me what the hummingbird is, but you actually super impressed me by telling me what the plant was. So, full.
Actually, I can't tell you what the hummingbird is. Maybe one of the coquettes. I don't
I
know.
think I think it's a copper-tailed hummingbird. I think I took that picture in Belize actually.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
but you're an expert in pollination and pollinators. So, and what's great, I think, talking to you, you're an all-rounder. You are. Would you call yourself a botanist as well? I mean, you are obviously an ornith.
Um, I I'm an ecologist who knows something about botany, who knows something about entomology, knows something about ornithology. But yeah, in fact I even say this in the book. I'm not the kind of botanist who can, you know, give you a rundown of all the characteristics of all the grasses that you find in Britain, and I'm not an ornithologist who can identify all the British birds just by their sounds they make. I'm an ecologist who's interested in the interactions between these as well. But I'm also interested in the cultural aspects of this as well. I mean, there's a whole chapter about that where I talk about, the Gibson guitar and the Nazca pot and other ways in which these birds and the flowers that they visit as sort of seeped into our cultural life as well, and our art and literature and so on. I'm as fascinated by that as well.
I think that's really interesting too, because for me, given that my whole normal raison d'etre is getting out there and telling people in urban areas about, or trying to engage them, should I say, in nature, you have to use cultural references sometimes to draw people in. And I think, as much as we often have this whole as a society, this whole thing about disconnection and we're totally disconnected, you can't walk down the street without seeing some reference to nature. The pub, the name of the street itself, the region you're in, it's the neighborhood. There's always the team of football or sport team you follow. There's always a reference somewhere, and we just need to be making that link more. Um, and I love, your book, but I love the urban section, obviously. I like the fact that for me, that's one of the takeout messages. It's all about, getting areas of your garden, maintaining it, for wildlife, for a wild area, which is not a difficult thing to do, is it?
Yeah, yeah, not at all. I mean, and so, yeah, certainly that's something I cover in pollinators and pollination, and a lot of people who are interested in pollinator conservation have discussed that. But in the tropics and the subtropics, people are doing this for hummingbirds and sunbirds and other flower visiting birds. They're planting local plants that will specifically attract those kinds of birds in. They're also putting up things like nectar feeders or sugar water feeders for hummingbirds as well, which is actually something I talk about again in the book. It's actually been banned in Costa Rica. All artificial feeding of animals has been completely banned in Costa Rica, because they're concerned that it's changing the behavior of these birds and other animals, and B, they're concerned about the transmission of diseases as well from the feeders. Similar to the issues around green finches in Britain. it's a fungal disease, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting that a country like Costa Rica it takes its wildlife very, very seriously, and is imposing those kind of bans. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm going to sit on the fence on that one. But interesting that they're looking at that in that sort of level.
Yeah, because I can't, would that actually affect, or yeah, would it affect the flowers themselves that are trying to attract these pollinators? I mean, surely it's not enough birds being fed at feeders to detract them from actually feeding from natural sources.
Well, that's an area that we don't have a lot of information about. It's only actually been studied in detail a handful of times. When I was in Brazil back in 2013, we started a project where we looked at this with a hummingbird garden that had been set up by a retired teacher. Um, and he'd started off with one hummingbird feeder that he'd made himself from a plastic bottle, and it attracted a few hummingbirds in. And then he put another one up, and it attracted a few more hummingbirds. And when we visited him, it was like Heathrow Airport. I mean, the birds were just zipping around everywhere. It was incredible. And he'd attracted something like it was over 20 different hummingbird species to the garden. Um, he was going through 2 pounds of sugar a day to refill these feeders. Um, and one of the things that we noticed is that the birds were incredibly aggressive with one another, and really battling for sort of territory on the best feeders. And he'd also noticed that some of the birds that would normally migrate from his part of Brazil into different parts of the country as plants came into flower or stopped flowering, those birds were staying in his garden because they knew that they had a source of food there. So it's changing the behavior of some of those birds. But we looked at whether it was affecting pollination for one of the bird pollinated flowers in that area. And we couldn't detect any effect of that. Whether it's happening with other plants, we don't know. I think in that case, it's quite a localized example. If if it was a more widespread practice across Brazil, I think I'd be more concerned. Brazil's a pretty big place.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting subject. We've actually had someone on previously, Dr. Alex Lees, who talked
Mm.
about bird feeding, and I think we need to revisit that subject again in the future in
Yeah,
conservation. Now, the most important question today, so be ready for this now, Jeff.
yeah.
Have you a favorite pollinating bird?
I have a favorite pollinating bird. Yeah, I'm gonna go for the Canary Island chiffchaff.
Oh,
Because there's a whole group of plants on the Canary Islands which are bird pollinated. And they're pollinated by things like Canary Island chiffchaff and Canary Island blue tit and some of the other generalist passerines there. Um, but the flowers themselves are really well adapted to visits by those birds. They're adapted in terms of the color and the amount of nectar that's being produced. But one of the ways in which they're adapted is that the flowers stay open for up to 3 weeks. Individual flowers staying open for up to 3 weeks because the flowers themselves are only getting visited maybe once every few days by these birds. So they've got to stay open longer to receive the pollen. So yeah, Canary Islands chiffchaff, which looks very much like the European chiffchaff, but is playing a really important role for these endemic Canary Island flowers.
well, I never knew that. It's the first time I didn't, obviously, I didn't know that was your favorite bird either in terms of pollinating. But
Yeah.
I saw my first ever ones this year, and I noted that I had longer beaks and slightly longer legs, but I didn't sort of think of anything else. And that's a really fascinating thing. I'll look at them with different eyes next time I see them. And if you could be anywhere in the world, Jeff, where would you be?
Tenerife.
Tenerife.
Tenerife. It's the most. So for what was it, 16 years, I think it was, I took a student field course to Tenerife every April. And that's where we first encountered those birds and first encountered those flowers. And I took the students out and showed them. I mean, Tenerife, if you've been there, you know, it's just the most fantastic um, natural laboratory of evolution. It's the place that Charles Darwin wanted to go when he was on the Beagle, and he wasn't allowed to because there'd been an outbreak of cholera back in Britain. The governor of Tenerife wouldn't allow them to land there. And there's a lot of speculation as to whether some of his ideas about evolution, particularly on islands, would actually have developed earlier if he'd been allowed to get off and visit Tenerife. It's the second highest island in the world after Hawaii, Big Island. It's got the most amazing flora, amazing culture there as well. The Guanches, the original inhabitants of it, got a lot of things going on for it, and it's just a wonderful place to go. But I haven't been back for a number of years, not since 2019, actually, just pre-pandemic. I need to go back soon.
Fantastic, fascinating. I need to go back to Tenerife and have that in mind now. Okay, well, listen, I'd like to thank you, Jeff, for sparing your time today to talk to us about this fascinating subject. Um, I'd like to thank the Zoomers who are here today as well for coming along to listen. And if you are watching this in the future, as I said before, please like and subscribe. There's a whole ton of different people I've been speaking to and different subjects, and there's more to come as well. So check out my website, theurbanbirderworld.com. And unfortunately, this is not a high-tech um, podcast, so there's no kind of little label that comes up with my website on it. So remember, theurbanbirderworld.com. And until we meet again, guys, keep looking up.